Well, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be with you. I want to ask you all a question. How many people here would think of themselves as a salesperson? How many people here, if you were at a cocktail party or some kind of event and they said, would all the salespeople raise their hand? How many of you would be proud to raise your hand for that? How many of you would be embarrassed to be called a salesperson? Be honest. Those of you that said you'd be embarrassed are actually in the majority. The reality is that when we do professional surveys, there's only one group that ranks lower than salespeople in terms of trustworthiness. Members of Congress. Yeah, right now, they've got a hefty lead. But when it comes to professions, what are some of the things that you've heard about salespeople? What are some of the words that you've heard associated with salespeople? Used car salesman. Pushy. Rude. Unethical. Pardon? Aggressive. Cheesy. Okay. Sleazy. Snakes. It doesn't take much to get you people going. I saw those hands going up a little bit earlier. Yeah, it doesn't take a lot, okay? I would like to introduce a new word into the sales vernacular. And that word is noble. And it's a word we don't typically associate with salespeople. But one of the objectives I have for this session is I'd like to, by the end, have you all be proud to think of yourself as a salesperson because you see it as a noble calling. So there's three things that I want to cover today. One, why sales is a noble profession. The second thing I want to talk about is the narrative of your organization. That is, how do you talk about yourself, your profession, and your organization? Because that is a very powerful thing. And the third thing that I want to talk about today is how you can bring a sense of noble purpose into the rest of your life, outside of work, to be happier and more successful. So if you look at how Webster's defines selling, and I want to read this to you. I pulled it off the internet, so it must be true. It says, the act of selling is to develop a belief in the truth, the value, or the desirability of your product. And so the role of a salesperson is to develop in others a belief in the value of what you are selling. So I want you to hold that in your mind as we go through this presentation, to develop in others a belief in the value of what you are selling, your product. That's what sales is about. So I told you that I wanted to introduce the idea that sales was a noble profession. So I want to start by telling you about a research study that I was part of. My consulting firm was working for a major biotech company. Are you guys getting reverb in the? Yeah, it's bad and I don't quite know what's causing it. So we got an AV guy around here? Okay, we don't.
I don't think you need it.
Huh?
Try it out, and I think for a time it will give you the same.
Okay, let's try it without it. There we go. We okay? Is that better? Okay. Do you want me to rewind the last 5 minutes? Because it was really good, okay? It was really, really good. And I like prepared and everything, so it's really, I really want to make sure you got that, okay? Remember there are going to be 3 points, everything? So let's go back, and what I want to do is just talk to you about this study that I was part of. So my consulting firm was hired by a biotech company. And we were faced with a particular challenge. It's a challenge almost every organization, sales organization or any type of organization is faced with. And we wanted to identify what was the difference between the top performers and the average performers. Now, those of you that have been in a leadership capacity know that to identify the difference between the average performers and the poor performers is pretty easy. Things like work habits, do they show up on time, do they know what they're talking about? That's pretty easy. But when you look at what is the difference between top performers and average performers, that becomes harder to pinpoint. Now, if you're in sales, you can see the difference in the numbers. It's right there. It's obvious. The challenge is what behaviors contribute to these big differences in numbers. And so this was a double-blind study. And it was double-blind in the sense that we, the researchers, did not know which were the top performers and which were the average performers when we went out with them. And so we went out in the field with all kinds of salespeople, and we watched them make their sales calls. Now, these particular salespeople sold some biotech drugs, and they called on physicians and other healthcare providers. And we watched them make their calls, and we noted how many questions they asked and what they said and how long the calls were. And we also did very extensive interviews because we were looking for what is that thing that makes the top performers different. So we were near the end of the study, and I had worked with a salesperson out in Phoenix, Arizona. It was July. Now, I don't know if you have ever had the experience of being in Phoenix, Arizona in July, wearing a suit, making sales calls all day long, but that's what we had done for 2 days even. So we're at the end of this, and I've worked in the field with a lot of people, and I knew this salesperson was excellent. I knew. It was just that feeling that you got from the moment I got in the car with her. So I'm there at the end of the study, and she's dropping me off at the airport, and I had a couple of minutes. And so I decided to ask her a question that I hadn't asked any of the other reps. That wasn't on our survey form, our interview forms. And so I asked her, what goes through your mind before you go out and make a sales call? And so she kind of looks around the car like, ooh, I don't know if I should tell this or not. And she says, I don't tell this to many people. Like, now I'm going to get the big secret. She goes, and so she looks real quiet in the car, like someone's going to hear us. And she says, I'll tell you what I think about. I think about one particular patient. She said, when I first started this job, I had been into it for a couple of months, and I was out calling on one of my doctors. And I was standing in the waiting room, and I was wearing a suit and a name badge, so I really stood out. She said, and so I'm standing there, waiting to talk to the doctor, and all of a sudden, this little old lady comes up to me, taps me on the shoulder, and says, excuse me, miss, are you the rep for XYZ drug? And she says, salesperson says, yes, ma'am, I am. And the small little woman says to her, well, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you because thanks to you, I have a life. Before I started, my doctor prescribed this drug, before I started taking it, I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't travel. I couldn't do anything. I was so debilitated. But now, thanks to you, I have a life. I can travel. I can go visit my grandkids. So thank you. And so this salesperson in this very buttoned-up corporate environment now is almost in tears. I'm almost in tears as I listen to this. And she says, you know what? I think about her every single day. That woman is my higher purpose. She said, when it's 4:30 on a rainy Friday afternoon and the other salespeople go home, I don't. Because people like her are counting on me. So this was about 6 years ago. So I thought about that, and I can still remember the moment like it was yesterday. I got on the plane, flew back to Atlanta, had plenty of time to think about it, and I knew that she had said something very important to me. And I thought about it, and I thought, was this the thing that we were looking for? This intangible thing that we just somehow couldn't put our finger on? Was it a sense of purpose? And so I went back through the transcripts of all the interviews, and nobody else had used that word. But then I dug a little deeper, and I started looking at some of the notes I'd taken. And there was a sales rep who talked about how he wanted to make doctors' lives easier because his dad had been a doctor, and it was such a hard job. Another person talked about how excited they were about the science and how amazing it was, the things that their drugs could do to the human body. And so as I looked through all those interviews, I found 7 reps that had alluded to that sense of purpose. And at the end of the study, the biotech company asked us, they said, we want to know if you can identify who you think the top performers were out of everyone that you were with. And I said, these 7, the 7 that had spoken about a sense of purpose. I think these are your top reps. I was 100% right. And the sales rep who had used the word purpose, who had talked about having a higher purpose in her job, was the #1 sales rep 3 years in a row. Her competitors were waking up every day thinking, I've got to sell more drugs, and she was waking up every day thinking, I have a purpose. I heal people. And it showed in her numbers. And so that single study led me on a quest. That was 6 years ago. That study led me on a quest. And since that time, I've spent over 10,000 hours in the field working with salespeople. And the research could not be more clear. Salespeople who show up with a sense of noble purpose, who truly want to make a difference to their customers, drive more revenue than the salespeople who are focused on sales goals and money. The research is absolutely clear. Now, this flies in the face of the way we traditionally talk to salespeople. And I think it has some profound implications for the philanthropic world as well. Because what do we typically talk to salespeople about? Numbers, quota. But yet, time and again, the people who drove the most revenue were the people who had a mental image of making a difference to their customers. Okay? There's more research on this. My colleague from Procter & Gamble, Jim Stengel, wrote a book called Grow. And his book, he documents over a 10-year period, companies who organize themselves around improving life for their customers outperform the S&P by almost 4 times. It's like 384%. So the research is there, yet what happens in the day-to-day environment of most organizations? It's all about the numbers. And that happens even in the nonprofit world, doesn't it? And so I told you that one of the things that I wanted you to walk away with was this understanding that selling is, in fact, a noble profession. And nowhere does this apply more than in your world. Because here's one of the things that happens when we work for a charity, a nonprofit, some philanthropic group. We think that what we're doing is so important and so meaningful that the value should be self-evident to the people we speak to. That we shouldn't have to, quote, sell it, because the dignity of it should speak for itself. But if you think about it, do you have competition? Oh, yes, you have lots of competition. And you think about all of the people that you compete against, and do they believe that their cause is equally as noble? Oh, yes, they do. Of course they do, or they wouldn't be doing it. And so one of the things that happens, though, is we often lose our frame of reference. This happens in the corporate world, and it also happens in the nonprofit world. We forget not only that do we have direct competition for the resources that we are trying to get, but we also have life competition, because the people that we're speaking to have busy lives. Your emails, your phone calls, your meetings are coming into the context of this from the school, and this with my family, and this with my job, and this with the, and it's all part of this big jumble of clutter. And that's why we have to be absolutely crystal clear on what we're doing, and more importantly, why we're doing it. And so I go back to that study. And the salespeople who had absolute clarity around how they were making a difference showed up in a different way for their interactions with their customers. So let me ask you a question. When someone walks into a meeting with you, or even on the phone, can you tell what they're thinking? Sometimes. You ever walked into a meeting, taken one look at the boss and gone, it's going to be a bad day. That? I knew that was amusing, but the reaction that just got tells me a lot about you people, okay? So I'll take that one step further. How many people watch the boss come in from the parking lot to see what kind of day it's going to be? we're communicating all the time. So I'm going to play a little game with you, okay? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to your neighbor just very quickly, and all I want you to do, don't think about it. Imagine you're at the soccer field or at a party and somebody asks you the age-old question, what do you do for a living? Turn to your neighbor, answer the question. What do you do for a living? Yeah. Okay. So that's where you just described what you did for a living. Now, I want you to remember, that's your baseline. I want you to remember what that felt like to say it, and I want you to remember what it sounded like to hear it, okay? So I told you that salespeople who show up with a sense of noble purpose drive more revenue. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. First and foremost, they drive more revenue because, quite frankly, they're more motivated because they know their work counts. They're not just doing it for themselves, they're doing it for a cause bigger than themselves. Their work is important. And when we act on behalf of others and things that we believe in, we go the extra mile, more than we would just for ourselves alone. But there's a couple of important things going on when you have absolute clarity around how you make a difference to customers. So I'm going to give you an example from two of my clients. I have one client that sells IT services. So they go out and they call on small businesses, and a small business would outsource their IT services for them. So when we first started working with them, if you'd asked any of their people, what do you do for a living, they would have said, I sell IT services. So after working with them, we crafted their noble sales purpose. And their noble sales purpose, we call it an NSP, is we help make small businesses more successful. And that came about as I listened to the stories that they told me about how small businesses were incredibly frustrated with their IT. It kept the hairdresser, the lawyer, the accountant, the bakery from doing the thing that they wanted to do because they were so frustrated with their computers. And I heard story after story. Perhaps you can relate to this. Have you ever related to your computer as if it could hear you? And all of a sudden, it goes. There are these moments where all of a sudden your computer goes from being this inanimate object to serve you to something evil, an evil persona that's trying to get you, that's trying to sabotage you. And in that moment, it takes on almost human-like characteristics where you're saying things to it that you would never say to another person if anyone could hear you. So, anyone relate? Okay. And so what happened was they described these scenarios, and they described small business owners, and they reached a conclusion that our job is to make sure that never happens so that they can be successful. And so their mantra, their noble sales purpose became, we help make small businesses more successful. And that drove every decision that they make. Everything had to pass through this filter. Will this help us make small businesses more successful? Every sales call that they made, I'm here to help make small businesses more successful. Every act of planning, every new product was all with that lens on it. So over a period of 2 years, their year-over-year sales in a down economy are up 35% because of that shift. Because every single person that works there says, I help make small businesses more successful. And what I'm going to here is what you tell yourself about what you do is very, very important. So I'm going to give you one more example, and then I'm going to ask you to do this. So another example, I work with a company that sells air dryers that take the air out of brakes on trains. So now picture this. They make these air dryers that take the compressed air out of the brakes on the trains so that no moisture gets into the brakes, so that the brakes don't freeze. I mean, talk about a sexy product. I mean, air dryers that take, this is just like crazy interesting stuff. And so if you ask them what they did, they would say, we make these air dryers, they take the compressed air out of the brakes, it makes the brakes work better. So we reframed that, and we realized that what they really did was they made transportation safer, faster, and more reliable because people were counting on them. If moisture gets into the air brakes on a train, the brakes freeze, the locomotive can't work. This is a big deal, okay? You ever hear about how trains are always on time? Yeah, it's kind of important in that business, okay, that they be safe, fast, and reliable. And so we made that shift. And I got to tell you, we took a bunch of engineers who would show up, oh, we do this, and we do this piece, and we do this piece, who shifted them to now they are the white knights of the transportation industry. We make transportation safer and faster and more reliable. That's what we do every day. How about you? Okay. And their sales are up in a similar fashion. And so what I want you to do now is I want you to think about that. And what happened in both of those companies and a number of other clients is they shifted from what they did, just the simple act of what they did, to the impact that they had on other people. And so how they made a difference. So now what I want you to do is I want you to think about a time, it could be in this job or another job, I want you to think about a time when you made a difference to someone. And so I'm not talking about the company spiel, about how many lives, I'm talking about you. When did you make a difference to someone at work? It could have been a donor, it could have been a colleague who needed an ear, but I want you to think about a time when you made a difference. And this time I'm going to give you a little bit of a chance to think about it before you do the activity, but I want you to really picture the person and the experience and what happened and how you knew you made a difference. You don't have to go into huge details when you're explaining it, but take a minute to think about it, and then I want to make sure you both have a turn, okay? So go with that activity now. So let me ask you a question. Was this time different than when I asked you to describe what you did for a living?
Yes.
How was it different?
There was passion and emotion in our responses.
There was passion and emotion in what you said?
We made an impact.
You made an impact? One thing I noticed from where I was sitting, the volume went up. That's a good thing. The volume definitely went up into the room. And the movement went up, because I can see from where I was sitting, people started to move more. So I want you to think about two things. First of all, what was the difference when you heard it from the other person?
Could relate to it.
You could relate to it. What else? It was a connection. It was personal. It encouraged a dialogue. That's an important thing to note. It encouraged a dialogue. Did you find yourself wanting to add to it? Mm-hmm. Probably had a better emotional connection. Leaned in a little bit more.
Had more clarity.
Had more clarity. Okay. So think about the response that it elicited from you when you heard another person talk about how they made a difference. All of a sudden, there you were with them, okay? Now I want to ask you, what were the differences when you were saying it? How did you feel? Did you feel differently when you were saying it, when you were describing? So the first I asked you to describe what you did for a living, answer the, soccer game question, and then the second time I asked you to describe making a difference. What was the difference in those two as a speaker? You were proud? Less scripted? You were going to say something, sir? Noble?
Noble.
I picked that word for a reason. You felt strong? More at ease? Confident, personal? All those things relate to what was happening in your brain. So usually when we describe what we do for a living, we just go through the perfunctory sort of check the box thing. I've said I work for the Salvation Army, I'm a sales consultant, blah, 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 blah. We could just say it in our sleep, okay? Even if it has some emotion in the words, we're not feeling emotion when we're saying it, we're just saying it in our sleep. The second time, what likely happened was you tapped into a deeper, more powerful part of your brain. If I were to do a brain scan on all of you, I bet you the second time your frontal lobes lit up. Because that's where you have access to, that's where a lot of your higher level emotions sit. Empathy, compassion, caring. Guess what else sits there? Greater levels of creativity, greater levels of problem solving. So when you made that shift from just describing your job in a very perfunctory sense, and you shifted over to describing a time when you made a difference, you went into a totally different part of your brain, and your listener responded. I asked you why you thought the people who had this sense of purpose were top performers. One was motivation. The other is they get a better response from everyone they talk to because they are literally coming from a different place in their brains. Same job, just a simple shift in thought in the way you think about it gets a different response from other people. So I asked you before if you could tell what I was thinking, if you could tell what a person's thinking. So I'm going to ask you now if you can tell what I'm thinking. I'm going to say something, and I want you to just guess. I'm going to say it 3 times, and I want you to see if you can guess if you know what I'm thinking. Where were you last night? Where were you last night? Where were you last night? What was I thinking the first time when I asked you? You're in trouble. You're in big trouble. What about when I was over here? The way that we think about things matters. It matters a lot. I said the exact same words. And so we can memorize all the scripts and we can know exactly the right words to say, but if our mind is in a space of, I got to get this donor, I'm not going to make my quota, the other person will feel it. And if our mind is in a space of noble purpose, which is I am here to help this person do the most good, they will feel that too. And so the second thing that I told you I wanted to talk to you about was the narrative of your organization. You see, you play a very powerful role in your organization because you establish the narrative. You've got all the great branding and all the great advertising and all of that out there, but that is not enough. It has to be infused in the way that you speak about your business internally. And I'm going to give you an example of what happens when the leaders of an organization do not have the right narrative. One need look no further than the automotive industry. So let's think about the automotive industry. They have absolutely genius engineers. It is amazing, the innovation in the automotive industry in recent years. They do wonderful, extensive consumer research to find out what we, John and Jane Q. Public, might want in a car. Lots of consumer research to identify all the bells and whistles and features that we might want. They have amazing ads. I watch these ads. The marketing is great. I feel smarter and safer and sexier when I just watch those cars. But then what happens when you go to the dealership? Anyone who has bought a car knows that it can be a soul-sucking experience. And why is that? Does that person care, that car salesperson? I know there are a few exceptions, and if someone wants to stand up on behalf of their industry, more power to you. But based on general public perception and my own personal experiences, does that salesperson care about you? What do they care about? One thing, closing the deal. And so what I would submit to you is the reason they care about one thing is not because they're a bad person, is because there's only one thing that their managers talk about. When they go to their weekly sales meeting, their managers aren't saying, let's see how many people we can make safer this week. Let's see how many middle-aged couples we can make feel sexy again. Let's see how many families we can provide reliable transportation for. You ready? Go, guys. They're not saying that. They're saying, how many can we sell? Because see, here's what happens. The internal conversation becomes the external conversation. And so if inside your organization all you talk about is numbers and quotas and targets, that's what's in everybody's head. And that becomes the external conversation. Even if they don't say it, when they're out interacting with other people, it's right here and the people can read it. And it all starts with that narrative. It all starts with the way you talk about your organization. Because the way you talk about your organization, the way you talk about your donors, the way you talk about customers, if you want to call them that affects the way that people think about them. And the way that they think about them affects the way that they interact with them. And so what I would challenge you right now is to say, you have a great tagline, doing the most good. I would challenge you to take that a step further and make that your personal noble sales purpose. That your job is to help people do the most good. It is literally the difference between someone showing up saying, I need to get more donors because we have this important work to do. Who is that person thinking about? Even if it's infused by this idea that we have all this important work to do. If I'm still there with that donor thinking, I need this so that we can go do that, what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about us. I'm not thinking about them. And that shift in thought, when you show up and say in your mind to a donor, I am here to help this person do the most good. That is my purpose, to help this person that's in front of me right now do the most good. You're going to create a completely different interaction. You can literally say the same words, but if you have those two different thoughts, they will feel it and it will unfold completely differently. Okay? So it's this subtle shift in thought, but it affects everything. It affects the way you run your meetings. It affects when you look at spreadsheets. It affects the way you interact with people out in the public. It affects the way that you talk about your job. So here's what I want you to do. Really quickly, with your partner, I want you to practice saying this. And I want you to pretend that someone asked you what you do for a living, and I want you to respond with whatever personalized version you want of, I help people do the most good, and here's how I do it. Okay? So I just want you to practice that real quickly. So what I'd like you to, and what I hope you are taking away from this experience is the way that we talk about our work matters. It matters to us, and it matters to the people who hear it. Because the way you talk about your work affects the way you show up for it. You create the narrative of your organization. Which leads me to the third point, which is how you can use some of these ideas to be happier and more successful in the rest of your life. Because just as you create the narrative of your organization, you create the narrative of your life. And the story that you tell yourself about your life affects how you feel about it and how you show up for it. Human beings have two fundamental emotional needs. Beyond food and shelter, we want connection and we want meaning. We want to know that we make a difference. But here's the thing that a lot of people miss, because we go out there looking for validation, but what we don't realize is we make a difference in the way that we show up for all that stuff that's right in front of us every day. And you know exactly what I'm talking about. We've all had the experience of a parent or a teacher or a boss who was just going through the motions and just trying to get everything done. And maybe you've been that parent, teacher, or boss. I know I have, where I'm looking at that list and leading what I call a check-the-box life. I'm just trying to get everything checked off by the end of the day. We've also had the experience of being with someone who was fully present for us, who was in the moment and who brought a sense of purpose into their interactions with us. And so this is the thing that I always tell people. If you want to make a difference, you don't have to change your life. You can simply change the way you feel about it and change the way you show up for it. Because we know this. We are at choice. Up here, we are always at choice about the way that we show up. And the techniques that I just shared with you for talking about your job, talking to donors, talking to other people on the staff, those same techniques apply in your personal life, where you get to decide, am I the person who just goes through the motions and tries to get it all done? Or am I the person who sees that I have a purpose here? I have a purpose. It doesn't mean I always have to be in charge. It doesn't mean I always have to be talking. It means that I have the ability to affect every single situation I show up for. It means that you have the ability to affect every single situation you show up for. Whether it's with your friends, with your family, at work, you are either going to add to that situation or you're going to detract from that situation. And a lot of it is based on the story that you tell yourself in your own mind. So when you decide that your work matters, guess what? That means your life matters. Because deciding that you're going to show up and love your job and make a difference, it opens up all of that in the rest of your life. Because one of the things that I've come to realize is we all want to make a difference. It's our greatest hope, and our greatest fear is that we don't. But we're a choice, because loving your job is just a gateway to loving your life. And so I want to close and leave you with these three things. Number one, sales is a noble profession, because when you are demonstrating to someone else the value of what you have to offer, when you are sharing something that you believe in, you are making a difference, because you're giving people the opportunity to be part of something bigger than they are, and that's what people want. So when you show up and you decide you're going to make a difference, it has a chain reaction on everyone else. So I hope that you will now be proud to call yourself a salesperson, because I know I'm proud to call myself a salesperson. The second thing is, you shape the narrative of your organization. When you decide that you are going to think and talk in terms of noble purpose, it radiates out onto everyone else. It has a positive impact on you, and it has a positive impact on every single other person that you touch. And the third thing, and perhaps the most important thing, is when you decide to show up with purpose, you realize the truth that's been there all along, which is you matter. You matter, your work matters, and your life matters. Matters a lot, so don't forget that. Thank you.
I want to thank Lisa so much for coming to work with us today in the Salvation Army. I work with our Major Gifts program, our Plain Giving program, our development program, and just to hear how we can tell our stories just a little bit better to show the impact to our donors and to show the impact of our donors to our administration is going to be fabulous and fantastic watching and moving forward. We'll look forward to doing more with Lisa in this coming year and how she can help change our culture, our character, in the way we do business, in the way we share and tell how we do business. So we want to thank Lisa for being with us.
I'm Steve Goodner with the Salvation Army. My job is to help people by doing the most good for them every day in their long-term plans. We are in the estate planning business. We're also in the business of raising funds for the Salvation Army. Today's session was good. It reinforced many things that I knew, but it also helped me to identify some areas where I could strengthen my approach, where I could share the stories that we hear so often in a much more effective manner, both inside the organization and outside the organization. Lisa is not only helpful, but obviously knows what the heart of the matter is, and that is to get to the things that really make a difference, the things that are impactful. And I appreciate everything that she shared with us today.